Welcome to Therapy Cafe, the Future of Mental Health Episode 2, Racial Stress and Trauma, Helping Youth Heal with our guest, Dr. Rihanna Elise Anderson. The pervasive impact of racial discrimination is a crucial and timely topic that will surely come up in your practice. Black youth face up to 6 instances of racism daily, especially through social media. In today's conversation, we'll explore the negative effects of these experiences on health. We'll share strategies you can use in your practice to help youth, parents, and caregivers manage and heal from racial stress and trauma. And we'll hear about Dr. Anderson's groundbreaking work that will help you incorporate technology into these solutions. Dr. Rihanna Elise Anderson is a fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University and is on leave as an associate professor at Columbia University School of Social Work. She earned her PhD in clinical and community psychology at the University of Virginia and completed a clinical and community psychology residency at Yale University's School of Medicine and a fellowship in applied psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Anderson aims to facilitate healing in Black families with practical applications of her research and clinical services, as well as through public engagement, teaching, mentorship, and policy recommendations. She is the developer and director of the Embrace intervention, engaging, managing, and bonding through race, the CEO and founder of Race Space, and loves to translate her work for a variety of audiences, particularly those with whom she serves in the community via blogs, videos, and literary articles. Don't forget, at the end of the podcast, we'll provide information about how you can obtain continuing education for this course. Also, ensure you never miss an episode by hitting the subscribe button. Here's to our conversation with Dr. Anderson. We are so excited to have you on here. So thank you. Thank you
so much. Thank you.
So before we get started, what inspired you to specialize in this area?
So Marjorie, you said that I was from Detroit, and I think that's really important to zoom into as a context. That space, which is, or it had for so long been the American city that had the highest population of Black residents, is the landscape in which I was born. So I have a biracial upbringing. My Black mother is raising me in a space where there are so many Black people and the history is so rich. And then my white father may take me out into the suburbs to do certain things. And I'm seeing literally a tale of two cities. There's an incredible divide between what we now know about 8 Mile as this literal dividing line, this place that was physically built, a wall to divide Black and white residents within a city so that they wouldn't get the same opportunities, wouldn't be able to do the same thing. So I'm living in a space as a biracial person, navigating these two worlds and seeing it firsthand. And it could not seep into me, right? Like that has to be a part of what I'm interested in. And I saw so many outcomes that were associated with this divide, the education, the healthcare, the folks that you interact with. So many things were associated with that divide. And I started asking questions very young, which makes for a good researcher, I would say. When you have those questions and you want to understand them, that is what led me to where I am today, Detroit, the love of my life.
It's really fascinating because I think, some people will just accept things that are unfair and things that are unjust. And then there's other people who are, we often use the term break glass, right? And they just say, this isn't right. This isn't fair. I'm questioning it. And now I want to figure out how to make it better. So the world is so lucky that we have people like you who say, I'm going to just sink my teeth into this and this is what I'm going to commit to. So I'm already thanking you for the work that you've done because it makes such a difference.
I hear you. And it's hard for me to even accept that by itself because there are people like my grandmother who were writing poems about discrimination in the 40s. And there were people in Detroit who have been doing this work for so long. So I'm really coming from a legacy of this, not only within my family, but the community itself. Detroit has been such a place of that breaking glass, of pushing back I really get it honest. I get it from the people around me in my community, and that's also why I pay homage to it.
That's so great. So I want to just kind of start with the fundamentals. Could you please help us understand how do we define racial discrimination?
Yeah. So, and I think it's also important to say that we're going between these terms of discrimination and racism as well. So it's really important to kind of get a global understanding of what is this idea of racism. So any ism is thinking about the power structure or a systematic or structural way of thinking about this construct. So race and racism is thinking about how folks who look different, and that's really it. There's not too much more about fundamentally having differences, but people who look different, creating different structures of power and hierarchy within those differences, and discrimination then being the behavioral outcome of what this set of hierarchies is. So when one discriminates against someone else, they are applying a behavior toward that person that affirms that difference. So if I think that my group is better than yours, that's racism. And if I prevent you from coming into my store or getting the education that you want, that's me applying discrimination to that belief that I have of racism.
Thank you. That was a really good explanation. Could you give us some examples?
Yeah. So one thing to be mindful of is, in addition to that structure of racism as kind of the umbrella, if you will, there are also different levels to it. So something can happen within me. I can be looking at a sign, a billboard can demonstrate this is the new face of, this is a literal example. When I'm walking around Philadelphia, there was a sign that said the new face of luxury. And I'm looking at that sign, and there were no people of color in that sign. And it's in West Philadelphia. It's in a predominantly Black neighborhood. So that's a message that's being sent to me of what luxury looks like. And this is often the case in beauty or intellect or any of these messages that can be passed to individuals, and we can internalize that. So internalized racism starts with the individual and maybe the messages or the words that we're seeing and hearing around us that can interrupt our sense of self. So that will be internalized. That's the basic layer. But then it can be between individuals. So that's interpersonal, what two people are experiencing and doing with one another. So that again can be if I'm going into a store and I'm not getting service in the way that other people are, or I'm being outright refused based on some of the beliefs that an individual has, that is an interpersonal level of discrimination. But then we can even go a layer and level above that. So an institutional approach might be that store that I just went into, if they have multiple stores across the United States and all of them have some sort of code or policy around serving people like me. So we can't serve those who look a certain way, which was much more blatant and in our face in the 50s and 60s, and less so today, though it still exists. Those are the institutional levels. And finally, the highest level, that structural level, when we think about national policies, national practices that may differentiate people's abilities. So one of the most obvious ones here is voting. Though people may not see the remnants of it today in the way that you may have blatantly seen it in the past, having a policy where you had to pay money or take a literacy test when your race was not able to go into education or not earning money in a certain way, that's eliminating an entire group of people based on who they are. And some of those policies have trickled down today in terms of what you have to do to be able to vote, where one can vote, and how folks can vote. So those are some of the ways that they may show up in today's times.
Wow, that was such a good description. It can happen just interpersonally, just on the things that you see, and then just two people. It's almost like I think a lot about meta messages, right? People say one thing, but they're really like implying a different message. So it sounds like this can also come into these meta messages on that interpersonal or the media. That was a great example of what luxury would look like. Yeah. And then just to kind of see how it plays out, almost like the way you described it. It's like you throw a rock in the water and then all the rings that go along with that. Right. So how help us understand, how does this impact Black individuals, specifically the youth? And I asked this question too because, like, I'm Jewish, and not a race, but a religion that has history of being discriminated against. But the difference is, I don't walk into a room and people immediately think, oh, this person's Jewish, and discriminate. Whereas when it comes to color, people can easily discriminate just based off of how someone looks,
Yeah.
not necessarily what their beliefs are. So I want to focus, now on just on Black individuals, and then youth.
Yeah, I think I love that you brought up really one of the key points is that discrimination doesn't just happen to any one group. And in fact, discrimination, whether it's happening to individuals or being perpetrated by individuals, chips away at all of our well-being. So it's not just that Black children or youth or adults are the only ones that are experiencing these effects or outcomes from discrimination, nor are they the only ones being discriminated against. So I think that's really important to start off with. What makes it unique, though, and you've already hit a few of the points, when you're thinking about someone who can phenotypically or visually be seen in a certain way, that might create a level of discrimination that other people don't face. But I think the other piece that's really interesting, more of the insidious piece, is the history of being able to address these discriminatory behaviors. So you indicated I'm a fellow at Harvard this year. I'm doing research on reparations, and that has me doing a lot of looking back at enslavement and post-enslavement, and the very clear disability. There was not an ability for people to say, you are treating me poorly, because that's a consequence that one can face. Especially within enslavement, you're being taught to shut your mouth, just do the work, and your family can be sold away. You can be lashed against, you could be hung if you speak back and out. So not so long ago, less than 200 years ago, there was this way of being that was, you can't say anything. And then after enslavement, there were these laws that continued to indicate that folks of color could not speak out. They could not talk about their discomfort. You couldn't go to a doctor and even get the treatment that you needed for pain because they wouldn't see you. They wouldn't believe you. So these things are not so far back that it's inconceivable that they would impact our daily lives. And that's what's happening to young people. They've been taught generation after generation, you can't speak out about this hurt and this pain that you're experiencing from being othered, from being said that you can't do something, from being told you're not good enough. You have to just suck it up. You have to work twice as hard. So that's putting more stress on their bodies and their minds to be able to achieve. And now, as you've indicated, we're talking about 5 incidents a day or more for these young people. Who are they supposed to talk to? The people that are discriminating against them, the care providers who they have to wait months to get on a list to see in certain areas. It's challenging to think about not only being told you can't talk about it, but then to whom do you talk about this with? Like, who is the provider that you can actually unpack this with? Mm-hmm. So it's psychological, it's physiological, and it's certainly passed down from generations to learn that you can't have a space to talk about this.
That's some of the work that I think is so fascinating, is this generational trauma. And I think I'm so grateful you're learning about this and studying it, because I do think it's just, I really, really believe that it's very, very real. And I think we all need to understand it more. Can we talk about the brain? Like what happens to the brain in response to racial trauma?
I want to definitely shout out the good folks at University of Georgia and Georgia State who are looking at this, especially Sierra Carter. So we're thinking about certain areas of the brain that are attentive to fear and hypervigilance. So when studies have been conducted where folks are able to get a brain scan and are being put through these simulations of what discrimination can look like, it's lighting up like, and I would say a Christmas tree, but I know we've already talked about Jewish background. So we're gonna talk about light up like New York City on a on a beautiful Times Square night, right? So it absolutely lights up, and it indicates that those areas are being used more for folk of color, for Black people in particular, than folks of other backgrounds when they're discriminated against. So there's again, even though everyone can experience discrimination, and that does happen to everyone, the area of the brain that recognizes fear and needing to do something about it, being hypervigilant, are more active than for other people and within Black people for other types of stressors.
Thank you so much for explaining the science so well. So, how does this show up day to day on a basis for Black youth? Someone once said to me, like this, very privileged comment about, I have 3 kids, and it's, we don't worry about our kids when they go walk into a store. But when you are a Black parent and you have Black kids, you have to worry about things like that at a level that, that I would say a white privilege doesn't even think about. It's not even things that enter our mind because it's not something that we've had to experience. And yet somebody who's Black maybe doesn't even think about it not happening because it's been their experience their whole life. So I just would love to hear about how this stuff shows up every day. What does it look and feel like? What's the impact? And,
Yeah,
and sorry, I was going to say, and
no,
then recognizing that it's unique to everybody.
yeah, no, everything you're saying is spot on, and I think it's so important for us just to pause in that moment of people having different experiences and other people being unable to understand that experience, because that is one of the stumbling blocks that I believe that we face in this work, that other people cannot even understand, and therefore they think it's not true, or therefore they apply this level of empiricism that may not be required in other studies or in other spaces. The type of treatment we've got just to be able to publish in mainstream journals has been interesting, because the pushback of the reviewers when they're sometimes going to reviewers that don't understand the content is it's a disbelief. So I really appreciate you bringing that point up, that just because one doesn't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And for at least 13% of our population, and certainly other populations, but in thinking about Black families in particular, this is an everyday historical generational occurrence that people are talking through and navigating through. So I think that's just an important context to start with. It's showing up, and again, I think you started this beautifully. It can really go one of two ways. One is that you're so used to it that it becomes part of the milieu, becomes part of the fabric of your life. You're just walking through, you see another sign about beauty, you see another, incident of someone being assaulted or a fatal killing, and it's like, okay, that's what happens, and you keep it moving. Because if you actually stop to take stock of it, to talk about it, to decompress, that's going to be a common occurrence where you might have to do this every day. And who has the time, the energy, the desire to do that on the daily? So I think that's a great first route that some people take, of just, I'm not going to deal with it. It's daily. But for other people, it might manifest in particularly depressive or anxious symptoms if there's a particularly traumatic incident. So certainly when we saw the uprising around George Floyd, a lot of what I hypothesized at that time was there were so many deaths all around us, and people were united thinking about how can we keep each other safe? What are the strategies we can do to stay alive? So to see that murder in the fabric of death all around us anyway, it was a disbelief. It was, how on earth is this possible that someone who just recovered from COVID is now being lost in the way that we have seen it before, but for some reason it aggravated some of those feelings that folks had for so long. So I bring that case up because it was particularly traumatic. And for some people, that feeling of exhaustion, depression, anxiety, stress may have emerged from that. But that doesn't exclude some of the more local incidents or things that may not reach national news. And young people are then going into classrooms on a Monday being asked to learn about ABCs when they just witnessed something on TV. They just experienced something in their neighborhood that they're not being allowed to unpack. So maybe those behaviors are showing up as disruptions, or maybe the quote insubordination, things that the children don't want to do in the classroom because they're dealing with this emotional challenge that we have not spent time unpacking with them. So thinking about ourselves as adults and agents here, are we giving them space to talk about when those incidents are happening? Are we pushing them if they're looking numb and they're not responding to this big thing that just happened? Should we try to pull for, is that really how you're feeling today? I know we'll get into some of the strategies later, but when you talk about how they respond to it, that numbing or that particular often dampening of symptoms, it's often mood symptoms that are depressive or anxious, but it could also be externalizing. So we have to be mindful of all of those potential ways of being.
I love the framework that you use, which is like, really, it's someone's experience and then it's the world in which they experience it with. And so it's fascinating to think about it, because when I just think about your experience, you just said that someone experiences something in their personal life and then they walk into the classroom and they're sort of expected to, or could be expected to, just, let's not talk about that. That also could be the unique experience of that teacher who has learned to just numb it and keep moving forward. And so that's where you can kind of see this generational, approach, where to change is going to be, it's a massive effort, because you really have to change it, as you would say, to go back to this like rock analogy, help people individually, help people who could be affecting that, could be media, could be all kinds of things, helping the system, helping the policy. I mean, there isn't a single person that doesn't contribute to this, that doesn't need to be affected by it. Can we talk a little bit about intersectionality? It's been a nuance that's come up in our educational work at PsychHub. So would you mind helping describe what intersectionality is, how it impacts the experience of discrimination and trauma, especially for the youth that are, experiencing it and trying to get their own identity?
Yeah. And again, there are scholars whose bread and butter this is. So I just want to be very clear that it's an important element, and there are definitely much better people to talk to about it. But one of the things that we know from an identity standpoint is that just like having or identifying with a race, so if I am biracial, that is one type of identity that I hold, and I can hold other identities. I can also identify as a woman, and those things in psychology have been treated often individually. So I'll study the variable of race and I'll study the variable of gender or sex, and then I'll talk about them as separate factors, as separate variables. And often this is because of our statistical analysis. But intersectionality, just like in the statistical form, if we multiply those two variables, those two things compound, and they mean something very different than either one of them individually. And just like in statistics, that could be multiplicative then for that outcome. So one example that I love to zoom into, when I was doing some work in Philly, there were Black young people that we had as a part of our research. And we were talking to them about some of the challenges that they saw in front of them. And Philly has one of the largest Muslim populations. So a lot of these children are identified as Muslim who were within our study. So they're talking about the fear that they had. This was 2016, and there were elections at that time. They were talking about the fear that they had of a certain candidate and what they would do to these young children. Would they be kicked out of the country? Would they be sent to jail? Some of the things that we recorded from them being 15 or 16 and talking about, as a Black Muslim child, this is what I'm concerned about. Or as a Black Muslim boy, Black Muslim girl. So you can have intersectional identities that go 2, 3, 4 times and beyond, and all of them combining to talk about that unique outcome, that unique experience for that person, really multiplies and exponentially weights what that young person may feel other folks think about them or are trying to do to them. So that's how I would think intersectionality in this space is important.
Wow, that's a That is a very interesting way to look at it. And that is, I could see how unique that gets because everybody kind of has different pieces to it. So, what are some effective approaches that we could use to deal with the impact of racial stress and trauma?
Yeah. As a therapist, talking, that's something that I really encourage. So I want to underscore that it's totally understandable that some people would not want to talk about it. And we've brought them both up, but to spell it out again, people who have had no experience with it and as a result may not believe that it exists, may not feel that it's important for them to broach it, or maybe they're afraid to broach it and talk about it. So on the one hand, you have folks that are potentially in a space where they haven't experienced it, don't believe it. On the other, you have people who have experienced it for so long that numbing has been an approach that they use, not talking about it, avoiding. That has been a strategy. And within psychology, we know that both of those strategies are effective. Avoidance for you in the short term feels really good. Your blinders on, you don't have to look at it, you're moving forward with respect to this stressor. But we also know that it eventually comes back around. You can't avoid forever. Those bars that you've put up to block those things out are not going to stand forever. That's going to find a way to seep into your line of sight, or often, as we're talking about, within the body or even in the brain. So it's not just what you can see anymore, it's what you're feeling, what you're perceiving, what is happening psychologically, physiologically, cognitively, etc., neurally. So it's not enough just to utilize the strategy of avoidance. Talking about it and approaching this problem when safe is really important. So some of the things that I encourage are regularity within families, within classrooms, within therapy, so that people can unpack and have a space to broach it. A number of my clients, or a number of people in my research studies, say, I've never talked about this because no one's ever asked, right? So it's one thing if you don't know how to talk about it in therapy, you've never put words to it, you don't know why that feeling pops up whenever you see the news, you can't think about what the language is. That's one thing, but it's another when no one has made a space or a path for you to bring it up, and you've been told your whole life, I shouldn't play the race card, I shouldn't complain about this, I should just keep going, put my head down, work twice as hard. If you don't have a space to say, like, how does that make you feel, just like we do in so many other things, then you're not going to do that. You're not going to bring it up yourself.
And then I'd have to think, if you don't create that space, you create your own sort of stories inside your head about the why things happen. And then those stories play out in confidence and self-esteem, taking risks and things like that.
You've nailed it. So individuals believe that they have done something wrong often for discrimination. So many of the studies will show the attribution bias is that I have contributed something negatively to this interaction, and that's why that person did that to me. So what families, what teachers, what therapists, what providers of young people's care and well-being can do is to dive into the history, normalize it, talk about how often it's happening to other people, and to give young people the agency to say, what would you like to do about it? Right. Let's put it all on the table. Would talking to this person directly feel good? Would balling up a sheet of paper and throwing it into the garbage? Like, what are the things that you would want to do? And let's practice those things, because that in and of itself can be as therapeutic as actually dealing with the human being that assaulted you in the first place.
Right. I love that. So you've done a lot of research on racial socialization, or RS. Help us what that is.
RS is our shorthand, because racial socialization, it's a lot of like, so we just, RS. Racial soc, which we also lovingly call it, is literally what we were just starting to dive into. So it's being able to have conversations, being able to create beliefs, values, and that transference between often parents and children, but really any provider of socializing messages to a young person. And again, that can happen in behavior or in conversation. So it's this often the study of what people are saying, And our research has dug a bit more into how competently are people doing it. So there's a lot of stress, a lot of fear, a lot of things that can block people talking to young folks. But if we're able to dive a bit more into our competency and ask, what would it take for us to be able to broach this topic more confidently with a young person, with more skill, with less stress? That's the research that we've been going into so that we can apply the practice more than just learn about what people are saying.
That's great. Oh, it's going to make such a difference. So to like move the conversation now to therapists and, let's talk about how we can bring this knowledge. They say, especially at the university setting where you're working, that the hardest part is that process from where it gets originated to when it gets into practice, right? And I think I've heard anywhere from 14 years, 12 years, trying to bring it down earlier. But it's so critical for everyone that we get this information disseminated as quickly and put into practice as fast as possible so we can, begin to start to see that change. So when we think about how, with everything you've learned and what you've studied, how therapists can put this into practice, what's important for therapists to know and what should they consider when they're supporting youth?
Oh, Marjorie, you're going into my favorite area here. So I've often come across the 17-year statistic. And so when I'm doing large talks with folks, I'll ask, what is 17? And some people will say a magazine, or like the age people go to prom. Like, we throw out these different things, and all those things are true. And in addition to it being the average number of years that it takes for science to get onto the world, it's also the age that Trayvon Martin was when he was killed, or Jordan Davis was, or any number of young people who have been impacted by discrimination. That's the age that those young people reach. So when we talk about what 17 years is, it's an entire lifetime or generation for some people. So that's too long for me to wait to get that application out into the world. I'm not happy with an entire generation not getting that work. I'd rather be wrong than for it not to get out into the world. So the things that I tell adults about in this space is that you cannot pass the buck. You can't expect that other people are going to be the ones to talk about it. And again, when we're thinking about families, often racial socialization is parent to child. And one might think a Black parent talking to their Black child about this is the best space for that to be. But I want to again push back and say it is possible for Black parents who have learned that not talking about it is an effective strategy is what they're going to apply in that family space. So it could be that child is going into a family space where they're not talking about it. Maybe their teacher doesn't want to talk about it. Maybe the media is telling them that they are thugs and they are monsters and any number of words that have been applied to our young people. And the only person that's going to intervene is you as a therapist. They have an hour of dedicated time with you a week to iron out their thoughts and feelings. What better place than to be able to broach this incredibly important subject? So that means for you as a therapist, regardless of your race, regardless of your experience, being comfortable talking about, approaching, getting resources, getting supervision, having clinical counseling, whatever it is that you need to do to get yourself together about racism is what you have to do to support the young people coming into your Zoom box, your office, whatever the space is. You have the opportunity to be the one adult or a member of adult support systems for that young person to change their lives. I want that for you. I really do.
That's great. Is it typical for someone that enters into treatment, with the intention of dealing with the impacts of racial trauma? Is that why they go in, or do they often miss that connection and they're not quite sure that that's what it is? Is it something that's happened in their life and that could be the undercurrent? And how does a provider determine if it's racial trauma or stress that could be the cause? What is the conversation of potentially exploring that look like?
Yeah. Some great questions there. So in earlier research, young people really did not, if you asked, have you experienced discrimination in that way? Oftentimes the answer is no. And then when you start to say, here are examples of discrimination, have any of these things ever happened to you? Oh yeah, yesterday. It becomes this space where maybe discrimination for them in their head is a cross burning, or it's a cocktail being thrown through a window. Like it could be these really large examples that they may be taught in schools of what racism or discrimination looks like, and maybe they don't have a sense of what it can actually be in their own life. So I have found both in the research and in my personal experience with young people that just asking that blanket question doesn't get you the entree that you might need to really dig. But I do think that young people these days have better vocabulary about what this is, and they've shared more experiences in online spaces as well. So I certainly see a changing of the wave and tide there around what young people might call their experiences, and they have different and better language for it, perhaps. So I think either way it goes, what you can do as a provider is, if you want to know about their discriminatory experiences, have a list of 10 or so common things that young people go through. And I, again, can tick some of them off for you, but has your teacher ever accused you of plagiarism or called you out or not called on you in class? Have the police ever pulled you over, or anyone in your family? Like there are these common experiences that can be found in our papers, talking to young people. If you watch any video about young people talking about it, you can glean these experiences and use that within your practice. Again, because some young people are not going to come in and say, this racialized event is why I'm here today, but me not sleeping or me being annoyed or me being checked out may be the result of that thing. And I don't have the language for it, but because I now know that you as a provider are tapped in to some of these experiences that people like me face, I might be more able to put those pieces together, or maybe more willing to do the digging and say, like, oh, that does sound kind of familiar, and maybe this happened after this thing. And then you as a provider can do the work too, to say what major incident or what community incident, or let me talk to other people to see if there was something that may have happened that potentiated this. So those are some of the ways one might navigate it in session.
I'm curious. I spent like about a decade working with the military, and I didn't know anything about the military when I first started that work. And in the very beginning, I felt like I needed to show them that I knew things and I was trying to learn everything. And then I got to this point, Rihanna, where I felt, which now I understand is more of that term cultural humility, but it felt more authentic for me to say, help me understand your experience. Like, help me understand what that was like. And then I could kind of learn it alongside with them. Yeah. Is that somewhat similar?
So I think a few things about that. I certainly think authenticity, vulnerability, all of those components as a therapist are important. And again, regardless of your background, because just because you're of color also doesn't mean that you understand the experience that someone is going through. So I think all of us approaching any client as we would with any issue of, tell me more about this. I want to understand more about your experience, because you're the only one that's gone through that experience, will be helpful. I also know that for young people, having to talk about and serve as this person who is explaining phenomena can be taxing, if they're, especially in certain situations, if they are one or two Black children in a school and they're constantly being tapped for certain explanations, that can be taxing on them as well. So it's a both and, Marjorie. We certainly have to come in understanding their unique experience and wanting to know from them and partnering with them in that discovery. And we also have to say, from what I know, this is the case. Am I on to something? Am I about right there? Or is there something else that you're experiencing? I think there's a way that we can show them we're making effort toward understanding, so that they don't have to take that labor on.
And then, not put the burden on them. I think that makes a lot of sense. So are there specific approaches and interventions that are particularly effective for supporting Black youth who've experienced trauma?
So there are certainly approaches that we can take within therapy that includes racial socialization. So if you think about the talk, which is, again, how are we talking about making sense of, exploring the beliefs and values that young people have based on the world around them. If we're utilizing racial socialization to talk to young people, that's going to be really critical. And my colleagues and I have integrated racial socialization into very basic approaches to therapy, like CBT or TFCBT, and a lot of our work is available freely to be able to see what we've done there. But it's truly understanding if you're going to use an approach like that, where you're looking at, I don't know if other therapists are still learning about CBT with the lens of Fluffy the cat, which is like, okay, there's this noise that happens in your kitchen. What's the first thing that you want to do? You want to get up, you want to call the police, you want to grab a knife, you're so scared. Okay, but you also have a precocious cat named Fluffy. Fluffy's in the kitchen. Now what do you do? Oh, you yell at the cat and say, Fluffy, go to sleep. I'm trying to go to sleep. Those are some of the ways that we've often thought about the cognitive triangle around, like, is there something that's looming out there that if we just put a little bit of explanation on, we could assuage some of the challenging thoughts that we have. Fluffy the cat is not fake. It is a real thing when we think about racism for young people, like them being pulled over more, them being stopped and frisked, them being called out in classrooms in ways that are consequence. Those are not things that they are making up. Like, this is a real thing. So for any therapist going into any strategy that you're using with that young person, you have to be mindful of, are you essentially calling racism the boogeyman? Are you making it, are you saying that it's illogical for them to believe this way? Or are there ways for you to understand this is the reality of society, and I'm going to blend some of perhaps the ways that they're approaching it? So hypervigilance doesn't serve you, but being vigilant might, or being avoidant may not serve you in all times, but in a case where a police officer is approaching you in a hostile way, that might actually be the time to do it. So I'm bringing this up because we have to use a flexible approach no matter what we're doing when we're talking to young people, because their beliefs may be applied in a way that's quite liberal, and maybe we want to reduce it, but it's not illogical and it's not faulty thinking. So it's a fine line.
Yeah, and I think it's such an important thing you bring up too, which is also everyone's different and everyone's experiences are unique. So we have to be flexible and just kind of how we look at those different things. So you've done amazing research, and you just seem so young. So I'm so excited about what you've done so far and what's ahead of you in your future. But most of it's been centered around theoretical advancements in RS, and I love racial soc. I think that sounds great. And TFCBT. The racial encounter coping appraisal and socialization theory, or recast. Can you talk to us a little bit about the principles of that theory?
Sure. So Dr. Howard Stevenson at the University of Pennsylvania is the original developer of that theory. I was his postdoc, and I was able to come in and help repackage it for a new generation and a new audience. And what we were pushing with Recast, again, is this thought that one can understand what it is that people are saying to young folks about racism, but how do we take it from that more observational lens and move it towards application? So when we're talking about competency, that was our major contribution within this field. What we're arguing is that we understand discrimination leads to negative psychological outcomes, just like a stress and coping theory from Lazarus and Folkman. Like, we understand that those basic environmental stressors leads to these negative outcomes. But there are several other constructs that we have to be mindful of because of society, because of the processes that young people are experiencing when they have that discrimination. So it's often not that young people are able to reduce their own stress from that environmental experience like one might be able to when they experience another type of stressor. You often need a family member, a therapist, someone else to be able to intervene and utilize racial socialization in a competent way to lead to better psychological outcomes. So again, the long story short here is that it does require a community. It requires a number of people to come together to support young people and to challenge that experience that they just had, so young people can be efficacious, they can adopt healthy coping strategies and have better psychological outcomes.
Thank you for explaining that. And I think that can lead us into what sounds like your core work, which is Embrace.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so let's talk about Embrace and let us know, how can therapists like integrate these principles, help us understand what it is, what are the different components to it?
Yeah. So we repackaged Recast when I was a postdoc, and we went to a school in Philly, and we were introducing ourselves and talking about the work that we were up to. And I was saying, okay, I'm just going to write a grant about taking recast and maybe making an intervention. And the principal of that school was like, we want that intervention. You got 3 months to get it to us. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? Like, this is not what we're supposed to be doing. I'm supposed to be taking this very tempered and slow approach to the science. But when people are actually saying we need this and this is what we want, for me, it was, I needed to heed that call. Again, I come from a space where I spent a lot of time with elders, and when they say something, you do it. And that's the way that I was raised. And so I was like, okay, let's see what we can do. I have a postdoc, I have 2 years, let's figure this out. And we developed Embrace with a multidisciplinary team across different folks within the city, including young people, and piloted it there. And ever since, we've been able to get it into different types of spaces. So within Los Angeles, for example, was at a children's hospital, or in Detroit along with community partners. So we've been able to take it to different spaces. And when COVID required us to shut down in-person trials, we were able to think about what are the things we would need to do to put this on digital platforms. How can we take some of the nuggets of it and put it into spaces where folks can freely grab these resources? So you were asking how therapists can integrate. We certainly have a number of articles, some with absolute free content around what we would do in our own sessions. So it's freely available. There are a number of webinars that I've done that are freely available either on my website or on the web. But we're also working so that 500,000 people, for example, on one type of platform can get access to it for free. We're also, thinking about how can we create our own website so that providers who need train the trainer models or digital components of it can just go straight to our website. So we're really working in response to what happened to COVID, or with COVID, to get those resources out.
Should we, and do you want to talk about the principles? Like it's some I'm reading my notes that Embrace stands for engaging, managing, and bonding through race.
Yeah.
Which I love that. That's a great thing. Should we just do you want to touch on the practice components?
Sure. Yeah. So what we're doing is blending the approach of racial socialization from the past, which is here are the ways that we've observed families talking about race, and Black families in particular. So you have cultural socialization, or having pride in your culture. You have preparation for bias, or the things that you need to do when you're in a discriminatory situation to be observant and protect yourself from what's going on. You've got promotion of mistrust, which is how we think about generalizing the mistrust that we may have for one person or a profession onto all of the people that are of that background. And then egalitarianism, which is not talking about it or espousing a colorblind approach. Those are the four major strategies that folks of color typically apply within their conversations. So we take those four approaches, and we also take the competency approaches that we've developed for racial socialization. And we spread it across 5 sessions so that what we're trying to do is dig into each of the ways that people have talked about it in the past, make them either more comfortable broaching it. So in the space of cultural socialization, you having pride for your race, it's really important that we start there so that the young people know that they are loved, they're cared for, they come from a community of care and trust before we go into things like preparing for bias. That can be really tough to talk about. Why is it that your parent is asking you to look both at a situation, to hold your hand at 10 and 2 when you're being pulled over, say yes sir, no sir when you're being pulled over? Like, why is it that your family is doing that? That can be a tough conversation to then go into if you don't have a sense of self and a sense of culture and community. So we start with a very grounding space, move into some more challenging conversations. And then for the last 2, the promotion of mistrust and egalitarianism, those might sound odd relative to the first 2, right? Where you're actually talking about culture, you're preparing for what's happening. But then parents sometimes promote a mistrust to their kids about folks, or they don't talk about it at all. So some people might ask, why would you even want to incorporate that in an intervention? But what's important is to say, again, you might be promoting mistrust because that's what you've been told as a young person. Or like, this is what, like, these are true things, that these things have happened to you and your community. But what happens when you talk to your children about that? Do they kind of recoil, or are they fearful? Are they crying, which is the case that happens with some of the families that we've worked with? What would you want the outcome to be? How can we get some of those messages across without your child feeling more anxious or more depressed? And finally, egalitarianism, where folks sometimes say we're equal despite race, or we're not using an approach that is race centric in our family. We'll be able to say, here are some of the articles, here's the data that show that talking about it in this way might be more effective than the approach that you're using. Can we practice it in sessions to become more competent in engaging and broaching that topic, rather than just saying we're all equal, or we shouldn't think about race? So we blend the historical with the more applied approach, and we think about it in the sessions of Embrace. How do we get more competent and comfortable talking about race in ways that people may naturally be doing it at home?
Thank you for all of this work, because when I hear it, it all makes just so much sense, and it's so thoughtful and so holistic. So for therapists who are new to treating racial trauma, what could be challenging for them?
So one thing that I acknowledge as a very cantankerous grad student who is not really happy with the level of conversation we had in our graduate training about this, we are pushing really hard through the American Psych Association or other larger organizations to ensure that we are actually creating content, creating spaces within training for folks to get more comfortable and more familiar with the history, the challenges, and why even the field of psychology is complicit in this, right? So it's as you have said multiple times here, you can't go anywhere and not be impacted by what racism in our country has done. So that's psychology is no stranger to that as well. So there's a reason that we haven't had this type of training before. And so if you're a young trainee coming out and you don't feel like you've had enough training in this, it's still a bit scary for you, know that my colleagues and I do webinars, we do workshops all the time, and we're more than happy to continue doing this work to make sure that folks are getting this training. But I do know that the APA is also working on these initiatives from the resolutions we passed in 2021 about anti-racism and dismantling that within our field. So kudos to APA for doing this work. There's also Association of Black Psychologists who have been working on this for the past 30 plus years. Well, I'm sorry, we're at our 50 year now. So 50 years of work within various IMPAs, or ethnic minority psych associations. So really important to give credit there as well. So it's coming. And if you don't feel confident and trained enough now, know that there are going to be better strategies for future generations, but you can also engage in workshops that we've been putting on. We'd be happy to work with you.
Thank you for saying that. So for those therapists that want to do that, they want to take on more, do you feel like, is that where, well, at the end of this, you'll tell us how they can find you and reach out?
Yeah. And certainly I'm one individual, right? So I'm not saying that you have to reach out to just me or even my colleagues. I think I can give 3 things that we always suggest for folks who are, whether you're, again, a parent, a provider, or anyone working directly with young people. It starts with yourself. So that's number 1. What type of work have you been doing to understand your beliefs and your practices? So that's going to require self-work. The second thing is, are you practicing? So just like you would for a job interview or any other work that you're engaging in, have you taken what you've now learned and practiced it with a colleague, with a friend, with yourself in the mirror, whatever it takes to get that word race out of your mouth? You would be surprised how many times we have been trying to put Embrace into a school setting, and people cannot say the word race or racism back to us. And I'm like, we put it in the title for you. just so you can say it. So get comfortable naming it, giving examples, practicing with, again, a peer friend, supervisor, yourself, whatever it takes to get the words out of your mouth. We know that's important. And the third thing is using resources. So again, these are skills that we use with our families as well. If you don't think you have the words, or if you want to go even deeper, there's a repository on a number of websites that my colleagues and I have collated at this point that give you language, they give you questions that you can ask, they give you tools to unpack with young people for free so that you don't feel stuck and you're in a situation where you don't have the words. So again, self-work, practice, and resources are the three things that you can do before you call me and my colleagues to come along.
That sounds perfect. Thank you. Those are some really good tips. So before we close, I want to just touch on technology, because it does, from what I understand, does sound like your research has also centered around the intersection of the approaches that we've discussed, and then how you can use technology, which we know teens do so much, in that healing process. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I love how you set this up for me too, because it's one thing for me to just say like, oh, I'm a dorky researcher and I want to go out and figure out technology. But it's another when young people are on their phones 10 hours a day and then we're asking them to come in for 45 minutes in person to talk. Like that, for some young people, they may really relish in that. But if you've been around young people enough, like they sometimes don't want to talk. Like they'd much rather type text, whatever. So again, some of our work did come with respect to the circumstances of COVID and needing to digitize, but we were also working on virtual reality content before that. And we were also responsive to what happened after that. So young people were telling us, we don't feel like there's enough stuff for us to do. We want to be able to do the work. I have a number of colleagues who are putting out workbooks, a number of colleagues like me who have done town halls and gathering young people. But then when my colleagues and I sat and thought about what do the young people want, what have they told us, the app was an idea that came out of those conversations with or across different sectors and particularly young people. So for the past year and a half, we've been working on an app, Teens Navigating the Talk, through my company, Race Space Inc., or our company, Race Space Inc., let me not say it's mine, it's ours, Race Space Inc., where we are thinking about taking exactly the strategies that we just covered, those three strategies of self-work, practice, and getting skills. So we're doing education for young people, awareness, and coping skill-based work in like a 10 to 15 minute app. And our goal is to continue building it out so that there's a safe community that young people can express what's going on. They can put events on there. They can do lives. So our hope is to really expand it so that there's a space that young people can have that's race-centric, that is going to improve mental health, and not it being among the suite of things that folks can get content for.
I love the notion of that too, because you could reach a lot more people.
Yeah.
It sounds like that could be more accessible for a lot more people to at least start to even think about that, aren't even thinking about race as part of, as we talked about. They're not even acknowledging because they've done the numbing or they're so used to it that, and so that I love that. So in closing, I mean, this was great. We've talked about racial stress. We've talked about coping theories and strategies that can, We've talked about racial stress, coping theories, and strategies that clinicians can use in therapy. We've talked about tools that treat mental health from the effects of discrimination. What would be the number one thing that therapists should take away from this discussion?
I'm so happy you asked, Marjorie. I would say we all have a responsibility to end racism. So it's not something that Black children or Black therapists, for that matter, are responsible for breaking down because we did not create it. And it is certainly not something that we can just put our hands up and say, I don't want anything to do with it because I don't see it, I don't recognize it, I didn't create it. We've all been complicit in living in this world and living in this society that has allowed certain practices or behaviors to be present. So we must all do our part. And for therapists, that means, again, we have a gift. We have the luxury of spending an hour or so with young people, digging into their deepest challenges and their biggest joys. We have that ability and that space. And it's not fair for you to say, this is the one area that I don't want to touch. It's such a central part of a young person's experience. And again, whether they are being targeted and being the victim of this or perpetrating it, which is something we haven't really touched on that much today, but for my work not to exist and for me to sleep well at night so that I'm not working the way that I am, I don't want to have to battle this thing. I need it to end. So we also need to bring it up to young people who might be perpetrating or thinking that this is a system that we should continue down the line. So certainly for targets, we want to relieve that stress and trauma, but we also want to make sure that other young people and other therapists don't believe that this is something we can continue into the next generation. No more 17 years, no more.
Yeah, I so agree with you with everything you said, because with all of this just breeds more hate, and that hate is just, it's so unhealthy on so many levels. And sometimes I do feel just scared and sad for the level of hate that does feel like it's brewing.
Mm,
And I'm one that believes we can solve so much of this with love, the antithesis
absolutely.
of hate, and empathy and understanding, right? And just compassion, and it is every single solitary person's responsibility. It's not, it doesn't, as we kind of started this, it isn't one person. And it's just, it also, I think we can make the argument that hate and discrimination, it's not healthy for you. It's not healthy for
No,
you mentally, physically, for anyone.
for anyone. And that's the final thing, right? It's not, we're not talking about just Black children's psychological well-being. We are literally saying that if we could rid this world of racism, if we could root racism out of our society, education, health, economic, what, every single person would be doing better. But by creating different castes and hierarchies, we are depriving ourselves of the ability to be optimally well. So that, I'm totally with you. Love is the definitely the way of doing that. Empathy is the way of doing that. And understanding that if not for whatever you believe and how we come to be, you could be in this person's shoes and not be trying to do something about it. So imagine if that were your life and what opportunities you have as in the skin or the body that you're in to be able to intervene.
Dr. Anderson, you're amazing. And I know that our listeners are going to want to get more from you. And again, as I already said, I'm so excited to see where the future brings you. How can people find out more information about you, your research, and implementing Embrace and just staying in touch?
Yeah, so I'm everywhere at Rihanna Elise. You can also find me at rihannaelise.com. And if you have five fingers on either hand, it's really easy to go RianaElise, rihannaelise.com, or at Rihanna Elise across platforms. And yeah, that's the best place.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. This was amazing, as I knew it would be, but your approach to it is so thoughtful and just in so many ways so beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Marjorie.
Thanks so much for listening to Therapy Cafe, the future of mental health. For more information and resources regarding today's topic, please take a look at the episode show notes. If you'd like to obtain continuing education as a psychologist, counselor, social worker, or therapist, you can purchase a 1-year subscription to PsychUp's learning platform. Once you're signed up, you'll have access to earn CEs for this and every Therapy Cafe episode. Plus, you'll have access to our existing library of over 100 evidence-based practice continuing education courses created by expert clinicians. Go to psychup.com/sign up for more information.